Guten Tag. Heute leider ist Professor Benjamin Schenk noch krank, deswegen komme ich wieder zu Ihnen. Und bevor ich unsere heutige Referentin vorstelle, würde ich gerne ein paar Wörter über die Prüfung nächste Woche sagen. Alle diese Informationen werden Sie auch auf Adam finden, aber ich sage nur kurz, dass die Prüfung findet am nächsten Montag, am 18. Dezember zwischen 14 Uhr, so Viertel nach 2 bis Viertel nach 3 statt. Und es handelt sich um eine Online-Multiple-Choice-Klausur mit Fragen zu den einzelnen Vorträgen der Ringvorlesung. Und pro Vortrag, es gibt so 2, 3 Fragen und dann können Sie eigentlich die richtigen, und dann gibt es 3 Antworten, nur eine Antwort ist richtig. Und es ist eigentlich eine Open-Book-Klausur. Sie können die Mitschriften, die Folien und andere Hilfsmaterialien verwenden. Was wichtig ist, Sie müssen nicht unbedingt diese Klausur hier machen. Sie können das an einem beliebigen Ort am eigenen Computer schreiben. Kurz bevor, ungefähr um 14 Uhr, bekommen Sie ein E-Mail mit Zugangsdetails und dann es gibt einen Link und dann zu dieser Online-Klausur. Und um die Klausur zu bestehen, müssen mindestens 2/3 aller Fragen richtig beantwortet werden. Wenn Sie an dieser Klausur nicht teilnehmen können, braucht man so diese Arztzeugnis. Und diejenigen, die die Klausur am 18. Dezember nicht bestehen oder krank waren, können die Klausur am 24. Januar wiederholen. Aber das ist richtig, dass es gibt diese eine Stunde am nächsten Montag um Viertel nach 2, wenn Sie diese Klausur, diese Prüfung schreiben können. Das ist nur diese Stunde, obwohl Sie das zu Hause machen können. Es ist nur diese Stunde, wenn Sie die Prüfung machen können. Und wie gesagt, alle diese Informationen stehen auch auf Adam. Und falls es einige Fragen gibt, vielleicht Oliver kann die beantworten, oder? Falls. Ja. Yeah, und jetzt I'll switch to English. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Olena Sobolieva. She is a senior researcher at the Research Institute of Ukrainian Studies in Kyiv, and she's one of the best experts and scholars working on Crimean Tatar culture in Ukraine. She's an anthropologist, she's an ethnographer, and she's also a historian. Working on Crimean Tatars, on contemporary ethnocultural processes in Crimea and everyday Islam. And she's one of the co-founders and the head of the Center for Applied Anthropology in Kyiv. And currently, she's a visiting scholar at the Department of Anthropology in Basel, the University of Basel. I would mention 2 books by Olena. The first one is the scholarly monograph, The Crimean Tatar Wedding, Traditional Forms and Their Transformation, published in Kyiv in 2015. And another book is Crimean Tatar Cuisine, published in 2019, which actually cannot be bought anymore. It was sold out, but it's a very nice book. So it's not only about cuisine, but it's also about traditions. It's also about culture of Crimean Tatars, not only in Crimea, but also on the, so to say, mainland Ukraine. So as I say, yes, Olena is indeed one of the most well-known scholars on Crimean Tatar questions in Ukraine, and she was with us. We had this workshop in September, I believe, Islam in Ukraine, and Olena was one of the speakers, and it was interesting to see the connections between all the speakers, because as you may imagine, in the Ukrainian studies, the field of Crimean Tatar studies is not that huge. So it's interesting to see how all scholars are connected. And we are very pleased and happy that Olena is here with us in Basel and can share her knowledge and experience and expertise with you. And today she will be talking about belonging to land and identity among Crimean Tatars after repatriation.
Thank you very much, Olena, for such detailed introduction. It's really big pleasure for me, and it's a great pleasure for me to present to you my ongoing research. And thank you all for coming today to this lecture. So the title of my today's talk is Belonging to Land and Identity Among Crimean Tatars After Repatriation. And in this lecture, I will try to address the issue of Crimean Tatars' ties to their native lands. The focus of my attention will be on the movement of mass return migration of Crimean Tatars to their native territories, to the homeland. And this process is called in literature mass spontaneous repatriation, and it took place in 80s and 90s. In the process of migration, the issue of land, territory, and landscape become particularly relevant. In this talk, I will try to touch upon several dimensions of Crimean Tatar relations with their land. For example, symbolic, metaphorical, material, and economic. I would like to note right away that the significant part of materials on which based my research and my today's talk was gathered me during field research in Crimea in the period from 2003 till 2012. It was the period before occupation of Crimea by Russian Federation. And the main methods of my research was in-depth interviews and participant observation. Here is the plan of my today's lecture. First of all, I would like to talk about history and context. I will give some historical context about the region, and we'll talk about the history of Crimean Tatar community, especially in 20th century. Then I will talk about landscape and memory. So I will describe you and talk about importance of memory and trauma in mobilization and return migration of Crimean Tatar community. And I also will talk about struggle for land. I will describe the particular Crimean Tatar case of struggling for land title in Crimea after repatriation. Let me start my talk with this slide and this picture. On this first slide, you can see the painting of famous Crimean Tatar artist and activist Mahmut Churlu, and the name of the painting is Deportation or Exile. In it, he depicts the certain act of deportation of Crimean Tatars from their native land in 1944. This act of deportation was starting point of a number of complex social transformation in the region. In 20th century, Crimea was a testing ground for demographic experiments of Soviet authorities and an arena of mass violence, such as collectivization, political repressions, persecution, and mass deportations. This process were accompanied with huge property transfers of houses, lands, and other private objects. Before we turn to the main topic, I would like to talk about the particular context of Crimean history. Crimean Tatars are a native ethnic group of Crimean Peninsula. The Ukrainian government recognized the Crimean Tatars as indigenous people of Crimea in 2021. The Crimean Peninsula has rather diverse landscape. At the beginning of the 20th century, the household culture of Crimean Tatars differed significantly depending on the place where they lived. In the steppe zone on the north of the peninsula, in the middle range, so in the middle mountains range of the peninsula, or in the southern coast in a village or in a towns. So there is a quotation from the interview I recorded in Crimea, and a woman who was born in Crimea before deportation, she said, "No one ever asked who we were. Everyone must have known we were Tatars, except of us. Rural people were called just Koi Adamları." So this quote shows that at that time, a regional and local identity still prevailed. The Crimean Tatars are mostly Sunni Muslims, and various Sunni fraternities have been playing an important role in Crimean since Middle Ages. In the late 18th century, Crimean Khanate, the state of Crimean Tatars, I will change this also slide, was conquered and annexed by Russia Empire, and Crimea became settler colony of Russian Empire. During the time of colonization, rights of Crimean Tatars were limited, their religion and culture were persecuted. The culmination of the policy, this colonial policy of Russian Empire and later Soviet Union towards Crimean Tatars was the act of deportation of Crimean Tatars to the Central Asia republics of the Soviet Union. The cultural landscape, identity, and sense of territorial belonging of Crimean Tatars changed dramatically after the deportation of 1944. So the official reason for the deportation was the accusation of the whole community by cooperation with the German army. According to the secret decree of Committee for Defense in 11 May 1944, and signed by Joseph Stalin, the operation of deportation of Crimean Tatar to Uzbek SSR and some other republic of Central Asia started on 18 May 1944. And over the following days, according to the official data, 191,000 people were deported to this other region of Soviet Union. The deportees were transported in freight wagons like cattle. Many children and old people would not withstand the journey and died on the way to the Central Asia. In all narratives about deportation, people emphasized that they were given only 15 minutes to gather their belongings. In those circumstances, they took only valuable things: jewelry, the Quran, some food or clothes. When they were living first year in difficult conditions of forced settlements in the Uzbek SSR and other Soviet republics, they were forced to exchange these valuable things for bread and other everyday necessities. Just 1 year later, after Second World War, the demobilized Crimean Tatars, soldiers of Red Army, who served in Red Army and were participating in the battles of the Second World War, they also were deported as their relatives and neighbors to the Central Asia republics. The regime of forced special settlements with movement restrictions was cancelled. So they lived in this regime of forced settlements on territories of Central Asia. And this regime was cancelled only in 1956. So over the next 12 years in the places of deportation, they were required to register every month and were forbidden to visit neighboring settlements, even in the case of the death of relatives. For non-compliance with the rules, offenders were sentenced to between 20 or 25 years of forced labor. A large number of people also died from malnutrition and various diseases in these first years of deportation. In the wake of this deportation of Crimean Tatars to Central Asia, the connection between the community and its cultural landscape, land, and special objects, such as cemeteries, mosques, shrines, houses, and gardens were lost. Immediately following Crimean Tatars' expulsion from their ancestral lands, Soviet government started an ideological transformation of Crimean cultural space by renaming places bearing Turkic names, destroying Muslim cemeteries and mosques, and resettling colonists from the central region of Russia and from Ukraine into cleared Crimean territories. Alongside this demographic and landscape transformation, Soviet authorities began a gradual process of eliminating and stigmatizing Crimean Tatars in history textbooks. A few decades later, little was reminded of the Crimean Tatar community on the peninsula. All of these official Soviet actions, forced replacement, rewriting of history, and renaming of toponyms can easily be understood within the frame of settler colonialist practices. I would like to make one remark. So this topic is covered in the doctoral thesis of Maxim Svezhentsev, titled Phantom Limb, Russian Settler Colonialism in Post-Soviet Crimea. He defended his thesis in Canada several years ago, and our community of researchers of Crimea are still waiting for his book on the basis of his doctoral thesis, but unfortunately, he now cannot work on his in his academic on his academic topics because from the beginning of the war he decided to go to Ukrainian army and defend his country as a volunteer fighter. So I just wanted to show this case to illustrate the current situation in Ukrainian academy. Unfortunately, the colonizers' discourse of alienating of Crimean Tatars community was inherited by Ukrainian official narrative in the first decades of independence. And rediscovering the Crimean Tatars' history and culture as indigenous people started only after the annexation of Crimea by Russian Federation in 2014. Inspired by the myths of Soviet era, the colonial attitude remained dominant in these first decades of independence, both in media and in public discourse. According to Soviet propaganda statements, the Crimean Tatars had been positioned as traitors, their culture considered less civilized than the culture of Russian colonists. The ethnic origin of the Crimean Tatars became associated exclusively with the nomads of Middle Ages, mainly with Mongol invasions. And after annexation of Crimea by Russian Federation, however, the Crimean Tatar community and its political leaders acted as almost the only organized force that resisted occupation on the peninsula. The expressed pro-Ukrainian position of Crimean Tatars made Ukrainian society rethink Crimean Tatars' role in current Ukrainian history. This is the photo from this pro-Ukrainian demonstration of Crimean Tatars at the beginning of occupation of the peninsula by Russian Federation in February 2014. Now I will talk about the particular case of repatriation of Crimean Tatars to the ethnic homeland. Attempts to return to their motherland began in 1960s, especially after 1967, when a decree on the illegal of previous allegation against Crimean Tatars was adopted. But the Soviet government didn't go beyond declaring a rehabilitation of Crimean Tatars. And the real right to return back to homeland they received much later. The biggest part of Crimean Tatar population moved from Central Asia to Crimea only after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the first attempts to return started in 70s and 80s. But the greatest flow of migration was actually in period of early 90s till the beginning of 2000s. So in 2001, for instance, 249,000 Crimean Tatars, more than 49,000 of Crimean Tatars lived in Crimea. And there they accounted 12% of the entire population of the peninsula at that time. So you can imagine that this flow of migration was really powerful and quite fast. In the post-Soviet history of Ukraine, this phenomena occupied a prominent place. Actually, this is the largest migration flow in the recent history of the country. And I would say that it has not been yet sufficiently studied and reflected upon. Interlocutors I spoke with always emphasized their connection with their homeland based on memories and emotions that persisted despite having built a really comfortable life during deportation period in Central Asia. I would like also to read a quotation from the interview. But despite the fact that we lived very well there, we had a good apartment, good neighbors, but we were drawn here. As I remember, I ran barefoot in Bakhchisarai. Childhood memory remains. We went to the forest, collected dogwood. I have a memory from my childhood. That is why I was drawn here. And we are in 90s years when there are already people, other Crimean Tatars who arrived in peninsula in previous years. When it is already free, we arrived here. We bought this house, half of a house. So very often people emphasize that they really they were able to build really a good life in countries of Central Asia. They were was trying to give a good education for their children and to have a good jobs in this at these countries, but nevertheless they were really all the time they was talking about their motherland and that they want to go back home. And actually this repatriation was made actually with the second generation of Crimean Tatars who were born in the countries of deportation. The process of mass migration of Crimean returnees to their native land coincided with the crisis of the Soviet system and the collapse of the USSR. And after Ukraine declared its independence, the government of the country adopted some laws which enabled the process of repatriation of Crimean Tatars to their ethnic homeland. Having come to Crimea, Crimean Tatars families were confronted with the issue of obtaining ownership on the land, on their native lands, and to receive housing. And there were several strategies how to receive this housing and ownership on the peninsula. They could buy a house or apartment by their own money, but this strategy was least common because not every family have enough of money. Other strategy was receiving land from the Ukrainian state, but very often these plots of land for building and construction were not very comfortable and convenient. And also other strategy was squatting on the land with subsequent legalization of this property. But I will talk about this a little bit later. Among the factors influencing where they would take up residence, economic pragmatism played a large part. And also access to infrastructure and job opportunities also were important. But also there were some administrative barriers that shaped their residence strategies. In the 80s, for instance, Crimean Tatar had been prohibited for settling in the southern area of the peninsula or close to the capital of the Autonomous Republic Crimea, Simferopol. Historically, before the deportation, the largest number of Crimean Tatars lived in the area of the southern coast and in the central mountainous part of the peninsula, in Bakhchisarai region, Belogorsk region, near Sudak, Yalta, Sevastopol. So here is a map with percents of Crimean Tatar population before deportation on the peninsula. The Nogai sub-ethnic group, it's the steppe inhabitants of Crimean Peninsula. They lived in the northern part of this region, but they were not, the population was not so big as on the southern part. But during the Soviet period, in Soviet times, the southern coast of Crimea was transformed into a touristic area with numerous sanatorium, hotels, and departmental institutions. And this explains why Crimean Tatar return to southern bank was so complicated, because it met with resistance from the Soviet authorities. They didn't want them to come back to this touristic, really famous part of the region. So nowadays, the largest number of Crimean Tatars continue to live in the central regions of the peninsula, Bakhchisarai, Simferopol, Belogorsk. You can see these regions where the percentage of Crimean Tatar population is the most, the highest. And also on the east of the peninsula, on the Kerch Peninsula, Kerch Peninsula itself, that part of the Crimea, which has this border with Russian Federation. But this region is really not really convenient for life. There is a steppe without water, without groundwater, and but still they had opportunity to receive lands on these territories. Also, this data of resettlement can be exemplified by my research in Crimea. I gathered information from interview in the period from 2006-2011. I interviewed 212 people previously deported from Crimea by Soviet authorities, and among them only 19% or 41 people returned to the area where they were born, and only 8%, 17 people returned to their hometown or village. So actually, when they returned back to Crimea, they mixed, they returned to other territories, but they also they appreciate some places which were really familiar to them. So, for example, I will give you, for example, a history of my interlocutor. It's a history of Rustem. He was trying to came back to Crimea in 1976 into Belogorsk region. This region was situated near to his Sudak region and has also mountainous landscape. But his efforts were not successful because of restrictions of authorities, and his family was forced to go to other region, to Russia. He moved to Kuban, a region situated in the south of Russia from the Taman Peninsula, next to the Crimean steppe town of Kerch. And he was only able to return back to Crimea after 15 years. But during this stay in Kuban, the steppe region became familiar to him. So he decided to return to Kerch. And about geography, actually, I will go back. This Kerch is this city, and Kerch and Taman. These localities between which in 2018 Russian Federation built Kerch bridge, and before that time the normal transport between all these territories was ferry crossing. And he said then next that in 1976 I came from Central Asia and stopped in Belogorsk region. Then in 1976 there were very uncomfortable times for us. They kicked us out. They didn't register. And during this period, all the time we were struggling with local authorities. And in the end, I was driven with a heart attack. And then he said that I was lying for 14 days, and then he moved to Kuban. But then he described that after 15 years, he decided not to go to other regions, but stayed in this steppe region, but moved to Kerch to his native land, to at least it is Crimea, but not his Sudak region. Another interlocutor explains why his family returned to the steppe region of the peninsula. Alim's parents and grandfathers were born in western steppe Crimea. That is why when they returned to their motherland, they chose the steppe city of Yevpatoria. It's a big city center in the western part of Crimean Peninsula. And here is also a quotation from interview. And he said, there were no other place back then in this part, only Yevpatoria. It was a sort of a center, but I was asking, but still not in Bakhchisarai. Are there Crimean Tatars too? I actually went to visit Bakhchisarai or Simferopol, and I don't feel comfortable there. And here I came to Ismail Bey, and I feel at home. Ismail Bey is a suburb of Yevpatoria. And then follow the story, really a long story about difficulties of life in this steppe region with huge mosquitoes and really dry climate. But he said, no, but my family really appreciate to live in this steppe region, not in the mountains. So Crimean Tatar families, in spite of administrative and economic difficulties, chose to live in areas closely related to their ancestors' lands and localities, steppe, mountains, coastal regions, both generally in terms of geographical location, but also drawn by the symbolical landscape. And now I would like to discuss the problem of symbolic meaning of the concept of land, native land and territory in the process of mass repatriation of Crimean Tatars. The connection between historical memory, land, and territorial identity is a really important topic in anthropological research and in historical research as well. And the connection, emotional connection with land is a really important thing in the process of return migration of Crimean Tatars to their ethnic homeland. The experience of persecution combined with the enduring sense of belonging to a particular place, Crimea, led to a large-scale political movement of resistance from Crimean Tatars against the Soviet government. It triggered return migration. Among the slogan of the repatriation movement was that we are on our native land. And this movement fought for the restoration of dignity and justice for parents and grandparents, as well as a desire for them to have an opportunity to die on our native lands. So in 60s, 80s, Crimean Tatar families were making memory journeys to Crimea before repatriation. During these short-term trips to the Crimea, they made these attempts to reconstruct in their imagination the landscape and the territory which was lost during the deportation. There are a lot of photos in family archives which illustrate this process of return migration and these memory trips to native localities. While staying on Peninsula, Crimean Tatars visited their native villages, returned to their abandoned homes, searched for the remains of cemeteries where the ancestors were buried, visited local sites. They brought gifts for relatives from their native lands, water from the wells, a handful of earth, and apple from the family's gardens. Here is also the interview with Shafia. She's actually explaining what I told you, that she was returning to the family garden and take apples for her relatives in Central Asia and then deliver these presents to their relatives. Even after resettlement, a tradition of visiting the ancestors' lands continued. Those trips became frequent once a year, and every Crimean Tatar family was trying to visit these villages, the old villages from which the ancestor came or were born. And these trips were accompanied by collective meals, prayers, and other commemorative practices. So here is also this photo of visiting family houses. And this quote from interview, that woman described that husband went there with children. They found something there, those stones laid out there. You can see that there was some house, gardens. They walked there with children. They found some dishes there, some stones. So this narratives are really widespread in interviews. In addition to memory journeys, Crimean Tatars practiced other forms of recreating the lost space and landscape. One of the methods of certain ethno-religious group to reclaim a geographical space is to incorporate the existence environment into the religious life of the community. So this form of adaptation to new cultural landscape is the construction of building of public worship. These mosques with minarets became new localities which represented Crimean Tatar community on the peninsula. According to 2008, 77 new mosques had been built on the peninsula. 57 mosques were reclaimed by Crimean Tatar community, and 146 facilities were adjusted for worship. In addition to religious buildings, a sacred space is shaped by the loci connected with the remembrance of the dead, such as graves and cemeteries, and Crimean Tatars started to rebuild this and to rediscover these localities in Crimea. Also, after returning to Crimea, Crimean Tatars began to revive the cult of local Muslim shrines and local pilgrimage. The graves of Muslim saints, local saints called Azizler. So these shrines situated on the whole in different localities of Crimea, and they started to rediscover these places, building some memorial sites on this place. For example, on this photo, there is a famous Crimean Tatar in Crimea at all shrine, Karadagh Aziz Baba, on the top, on the summit of the mountain of Karadagh. An important also strategy for restoring the old cultural landscape is to work with the restoration of Turkic toponymic and also amateur historian practices and ethnographic practices. There were published a lot of books about different localities of Crimea, and here is a story of Refat Muslimov. He's really interesting case of returning back to his native village, Koz, Sonячna Dolina, on the southern bank of the Black Sea region, southern part of the peninsula. So he was trying to come back in late 60s. At the time, it was still official ban for registration for Crimean Tatars. His family went through a lot of difficulties and huge problems. So they was trying to come back to this village several times, and then he built the house in his native village, but also he built memorials on the local shrines, and also memorial on the grave of soldiers of Red Army who were buried in his native village, because he was one of the person who saw by his own eyes where they were buried during the Second World War. And also he published a book about his native village in Crimean Tatar language with mental maps, with all information based on his memories and memories of his neighbors. So, and this case is really interesting because he is a mechanical engineer by profession. And also he was the person who found fundings and organized building mosque in his native village and become an imam in this mosque. And he was imam for several years. So being a mechanical engineer, he was really involved in the process of revival and reconstruction of memories about his native village and native localities. Another way of reconstruction of a landscape, traditional ethnic landscape, was artistic practices. In 2005, I was participating in one of the first seminar organized by Mahmut Chirlu, the artist. His painting you have seen on the beginning of this lecture, in his house on the way from the steppe to the southern part of Crimea. This seminar was organized for artists and crafters, and the main purpose was to discover, to learn about Crimean Tatar decorative art, embroidery. So we were not only painting and learning something, we also had several journeys to Crimean mountains. And Mahmut Chirlu was asking us to notice the particularities of the landscape of Crimean mountains, the color of trees and plants, the color of soil, stones, and sky. And he emphasized that all these particularities of native landscape is really embodied, connected with the traditional art. So all these practices of artists, and also this activity, it was the first seminar, but it was followed by second, third, and whatever. And the culmination of this activity of this group of artists was inclusion of traditional Crimean Tatar ornament into the list of intangible cultural heritage of Ukraine and later of UNESCO. So these artists, they were trying to make some things visible for themselves and for the community and for the neighbors. For example, such things as connections between culture and nature, between landscape and community, and also they wanted to show the importance of inheritance traditions on this territory by Crimean Tatars and other people who are interested with their culture. Now I would like to turn to other part of my talk. It's a material. Now I would like to talk about the material and economic aspects of interactions of Crimean Tatar community with the native landscape. Actually, I would make a little bit theoretical introduction. Anthropologists have had a long-standing interest in issues related to property, dating back to the institutionalization of the discipline in beginning of 20th century. At that time, they were interested with such topics as property relation in indigenous societies. But then, from the second half of the 20th century, a study of property in anthropology revolved around a variety of other topics. For example, such as legal pluralism, social structure, conflict, kinship, relations with inheritance, property and gender, politics and power relations. In this particular case, I would like to emphasize the importance of notions of morality and justice which influence economical decisions of Crimean Tatar community. And this is really important to notice the theory of Edward Palmer Thompson, historians who introduced the theory of moral economy. And actually, I would like to say that the whole economic activities of Crimean Tatars regarding their native land was really grounded on these notions of morality and justice. So at the beginning of the mass repatriation, particularly in 90s, after the place of residence was chosen, a long process of obtaining land plots and building houses began for the newly returned Crimean Tatars. Legislative mechanism for allocation of land plots and housing to repatriates were not regulated at that time. And this led to a conflict around the land issues in Ukrainian contemporary history in the Crimean region. For decades, so-called samozahvat or squatting was the most commonly used form for receiving land plots and building houses for Crimean Tatar returnees. For this purpose, I would just describe in a few words how it was organized. For this purpose, self-organized groups of returnees found plots. It was almost all the time, it was always abundant lands or in common use, collective use from the Soviet period. They hired lawyers. All the time there were negotiations between local authorities. They also hired architecture and engineers who were making for them all documentations with the maps of future settlement with all facilities like water, gas, and electricity. And then they took these documents and they went to courts. And after several years, usually these plots of land and these settlements were recognized by authorities and recognized in courts. The important thing is that the main logic of these land activities was restoration of the rights for returnees to own land on the territory of their historical homeland. In the Ukrainian legal system, after the collapse of the Soviet collective farm system, only members of collective farms were able to receive plots from the state in private ownership. But repatriates from Central Asia, they came back in 90s, so they didn't manage to become the part of these collective farms. So when the land was distributed between the members, between the citizens of Crimea, of Ukraine, they were not a part of this game. That's why they decided that they have this moral right to claim the land title, their rights for land on the in different parts of Crimea. So restitution of old property for I would show this slide, then I will return back to other. Restitution of old property would remain impossible for Crimean Tatars, as the former property of Crimean Tatar families had long been redistributed among other residents of Crimea. Old Crimean Tatar houses had been inhabited for many decades by other people, typically Russians and Ukrainians. They had mostly been resettled on this territory after the deportation of Crimean Tatars. Even the Mejlis is a representative body of Crimean Tatar community, like a small parliament for Crimean Tatars in that period. So Mejlis never claimed that Crimean Tatars should claim the restitution of the rights for property, because it was unrealistic at that time, and it's unrealistic now as well. Since the restitution of property was out of the question, so Crimean Tatars invoke in their moral right to engage a prolonged conflict and claim their land title. As I was saying at the beginning, not every Crimean Tatar family was able to buy land or housing for their own money, and land given from the state was really inconvenient with lack of electricity, gas, and other facilities, problems with transport. So they just was trying to satisfy their need of housing, choosing land which was more or less convenient for living, like near some big cities like Yevpatoria, Simferopol, or Kerch. And they made their squatting zones with temporary buildings and then legalized this land in courts after several years. Actually, also, it is important to know that a moratorium on the commercial and sale and purchase of agricultural land in Ukraine was lifted only in 2021. So at that time, at the first decades of independence, market of agricultural land was in shadow. And it was a lot of things regarding bribery and corruption among this redistributing of former Soviet collective lands. And there were a lot of other actors who were claiming the land rights in Crimea. For example, developer companies, big holdings, agricultural holdings, and new owners of agricultural land. And Crimean Tatars become really important actor in these games of redistribution of former collective lands in Crimea. Here is a quotation from the interview with Crimean Tatar leader Umerov, who said that we asked for the adoption of normative documents according to which land would be issued free of charge to returning Crimean Tatars. But the local authorities said that there were no grounds for this. Then people start just occupying vacant plots. Those about 200 new settlements and micro districts appeared in Crimea, which de facto stood on land that were not registered in any way. And this problem was solved. So you can imagine the dimensions of this process. So these squatting zones and squatting settlements, they were really widespread in Crimea. 300 settlements, it's a big dimensions. And also this squatting zone, they included hundreds and thousands of participants. It's not like 10 people or 20 people coming to some localities and claiming their land plots. So one squatting zone could accounted 1,000 of future households. And actually, in this way, the whole new Crimean Tatar settlements appeared on the peninsula. They also marked all individual plots with these small buildings like cube, and also marked all new districts, and also marked the new mosques, mosques or religious building. On this slide, you can see that this squatting zone with future houses and future mosque. It's near Simferopol in Crimea. How long I have? 10 minutes. I would like also mention one important things of this property redistribution of property rights in Crimea. The events associated with annexation of Crimea by Russian Federation in March 2014. This event was really important in this property issues in Crimea, and actually this event led to forced migration of Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars from Crimea to mainland Ukraine. According to estimates, according to data from Anton Korinevich, a representative of Ukrainian president in Autonomous Republic Crimea, between 2014 and 2021, nearly 100,000 people left Crimea. The main reason of migration was political, because Crimean Tatars and Ukrainian citizens, they were subjected to political repressions from Russian Federation. And this reality of occupation and forced migration revived the problem of property loss as forced migrants claim that they now are in the same situation as their parents were during deportation. And actually, the annexation of Crimea by Russian Federation led to a huge series of violations of Ukrainian private and state property rights. And according to data of 2015, direct losses of state and private property amounted 1 trillion hryvnias at more than $44 billion. It's all state and private property on the peninsula. Violation of property rights have continued in following years. For example, in April 2020, President of Russian Federation established a ban for Ukrainians and actually for all foreigners to from owning land plots in most regions of Crimea. The land in Crimea was owned by a significant part of Crimean Tatars who were now in the mainland part of Ukraine, in other cities of Ukraine. So they were subject of this law. And Ukrainian officials, they said that they didn't recognize, of course, this law and said that all Ukrainian citizens should keep their property documents and their rights on their land property would be restored after the occupation of Crimean Peninsula. So now I would like to turn to my conclusions and I would like to say that this spontaneous and massive repatriation of Crimean Tatars that took place at the turn of the 21st century was accompanied by demands for establishing historical justice and the return of land titles to repatriates. Memories of land, native land and ancestral houses were a consolidating factor for those demands during the repatriation. The reproduction of memory and connection with the homeland took various forms. Memorial tourism, or memorial trips, I would like better to say, artistic practices, publishing activity, religious practices in space. Believing that the trauma resulting from political repression and forced migration may be partly offset by receiving of land by repatriates, the repatriation process itself emphasized the implementation of the right of Crimean Tatars to live on their own land. The demand to receive property became the central political slogan for the mobilization movement of the political struggle for rights for Crimean Tatars. This demand for the return of property was based on a principle of moral economy. Since the old houses had long been destroyed or were inhabited by other people, the possibility of restitution of these former properties was not even discussed at that time. And this land acquisition and building their own homes on the native lands was perceived by Crimean Tatars as a final stage of repatriation. And also, I would like to say that this whole activity is symbolical and also economic and building activities of Crimean Tatars made them really visible actors on the cultural landscape of current Crimean Peninsula. Now we can see these minarets and these settlements of repatriates in every region of Crimea. They were trying to claim their right to their land, not only in symbolical forms like restoring historical sites, cultural sites, architecture, traditional architecture, etc., but also with their building activities, making new settlements with Turkic names, with mosques, building new touristic sites with Crimean Tatar names, etc. So at that time, Crimean Tatar community really was able to become a really powerful social force on the peninsula. And this events associated with annexation of Crimea by Russian Federation actually revive this mutual claims of property and violation of property rights on the peninsula. So I would like to end my presentation with other painting of Mahmoud Churlu, which is called Return, and it depicts this temporal buildings in squatting zone in the suburb of city Simferopol, and in a few years this squatting zone will become a new Crimean Tatar settlement. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.